Good morning, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Ranch in Dallas, New Mexico, working on oil painting cane. Alright, today I'm just going to work on details and fleshing out some of the color and what's already been developed. I think my camera cut last time I was filming in the middle of working on some of the cityscape. Today I'm going to add some more yellow, some cadmium yellow, and some Payne's gray and white for the smoke plumes that are going to be emanating, or coming out of some of the burning buildings there. And we're going to put some brown on the ground in front of the wall to give it a little more color and division, and then line out the bricks on the wall. And if I have enough time after that, we'll see what I do after that. But that's it for the moment, so here we go.
So I want to ask Professor Tomash about why President Biden is there at this moment. I mean, to promote the multi-billion-dollar Libido corridor, that 835-mile railway project connecting the city of Libido in Angola to the Democratic Republic of Congo and Zambia as well. This show of U.S. investment is meant to counter China's increasing influence in Africa, the sort of alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative. Can you talk about that, China's presence in Africa, and where the U.S. stands in relation to that?
We know why Biden is in Angola. You know, we are in a moment of transition from fossil energies to greener energies, and then we know, that in the next few decades, some minerals will be preponderant, very important for the economy, for the economy, for the global economy, right? Minerals such as cobalt, lithium, and copper. Right, and we know that some of the sources of these minerals, some of the largest sources for the extraction of these minerals are in close to Angola, right, in the Congo and in RDC and Zambia. And so this is an opportunity. It's a way to sort of revitalize the Benguela Railway that was built by the Portuguese with British and South African interests in the 1900s. So to revitalize this railway, and to be able to transport, to be able to ship the minerals from these sources, to the coast, to Lobito, to the port of Lobito, right? But we also know that Angola provides something that U.S. is looking for, in terms of creating partnerships in Africa, because Angola is one of the most stable political regimes in Africa. We have the same ruling party since 1975. We only had 3 presidents, one of them stayed in power for almost 40 years, So to have an infrastructure that runs for more than, 1,000 kilometers, it will require a great deal of security and safety. And U.S., of course, are sure, or at least they want to be sure that the Angolans can provide that.
And Antonio Tomash, I wanted to ask you, much has been made of the debt, that the $40 billion in debt that Angola owes to China. I should remark that that's about half of the debt that Puerto Rico owed to the United States bondholders, tiny Puerto Rico. But how is China regarded by the Angolan people? Because it's been involved in economic development projects in Africa now for decades.
Oh yeah, this is of course. I think it's important to see, when China started to become involved in Angola. That was, after the war, when the boom, the oil boom was also taking place. So Angola had at this moment, a great deal of financial resources and so on. So China got involved, and China, loan all this money to Angola, and I think now that the country is going through, profound economic crisis, Angola has been struggling to pay these debts. A lot of this money was used for the reconstruction of the infrastructure that were destroyed by the war, point, dams, bridges, and so on. But a lot of this money also was used to enrich, for some people to enrich themselves, and particularly to transfer, these amounts of money and to buy property, elsewhere in South Africa or Portugal, in Europe or in US, So a lot of this money have been used or has been canalized, has been used for personal purposes, and now Angolans are paying actually, the debts that the country owes to China, and of course China is still involved in a great deal of projects in Angola, in a great deal of construction and rebuilding, and I think this is the place that US wants to occupy.
I wanted to end by going to Zenaida. Human Rights Watch has written about how the projects connect with crackdowns on protests in Angola, projects that exacerbate poverty and other conditions for people in Angola, only enriching a few. And you're speaking to us from Mozambique. I'm wondering if you can also talk about the ongoing nationwide protests there following the elections in October, when the long-ruling Frelimo party declared victory. The opposition leader, Venancio Mondlane, has repeatedly called on supporters to take to the streets over allegations of voter fraud, as well as Mozambique's debt crisis, corruption, and other issues. Mozambique authorities have unleashed a brutal crackdown on protesters, killing at least 24 people. If you can put those two issues together.
Briefly, let me just end with the Angola element first. I mean, we mentioned that Biden is going to Angola to counter the influence of China, but unfortunately, we haven't seen him doing anything different from what China has done over the past decade, which is to do economic and business deals with the government of Angola and forgetting to implement projects that benefit the rest of the population. And unfortunately, Biden seems to be missing an important opportunity to address serious human rights issues and economic and social inequalities that Angola has been married with over the past few years. And we wanted to use also this opportunity to once again appeal to Biden to use this opportunity to at least get a public commitment from President João Lourenço that he will investigate the human rights abuses, especially those that were committed by security forces, and all those accountable to account. And of course, the victims need to see mechanisms of redress. Now, going to your question about Mozambique, I mean, Angola and Mozambique are very similar countries. They come from very similar backgrounds, long civil wars, huge influence of the Cold War, and as a consequence of that, they have built these security forces that are very heavy-handed, ruthless, prepared to defend the country and the regime in place against an enemy, not necessarily prepared to defend the population and the citizens and the constitution. And what we have seen in Mozambique since elections is exactly that. It's a demonstration on how security forces are on the ground to protect the interests of a few group of people that belong to the ruling party. And they are ready to do anything for that, including killing protesters, unarmed protesters, killing children. We have documented that at least 10 children between 1 and 17 years have been killed by security forces, ready to use live ammunition against anyone that dares to go to the streets and challenges the government in place. We have thousands of Mozambicans almost every day going to the streets, protesting in different manners, most of it peacefully. against the election results. They believe the elections were rigged. The Constitutional Council is at the moment analyzing the evidence of rigging. But while the Constitutional Council waits to pronounce itself about the final results, the Mozambican people have the right to go out on the streets. The Constitution provides that, to go out on the streets and protest against what they felt was a flawed process. But the security forces have not allowed them to do that. They used excessive force against protesters. As a consequence, we have dozens of people killed. Our partners on the ground are speaking about 67 people killed right now as we speak. And that is for 6 weeks of protest. We have also documented cases where children were killed by live bullets, but many children were also seriously affected by the indiscriminate use of tear gas against residences.
Zenaida, we want to thank you so much for being with us. We will continue to cover these issues both in Mozambique and Angola. Zenaida Machado is Angola and Mozambique senior researcher at Human Rights Watch. She was joining us from Maputo, the capital of Mozambique, formerly with the BBC. And we want to thank Antonio Tomas, Angolan scholar, associate professor of anthropology at the University of California, Irvine. Coming up, as President Biden faces bipartisan criticism for pardoning his son Hunter, we'll speak to the Last Prisoner Project about the group's call for Biden to free federal prisoners held on marijuana charges. Stay with us. By the Angolan singer Lourdes Van Dunham. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, War, Peace, and the Presidency. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. President Biden's continuing to face criticism over his decision to issue a sweeping pardon to his son, Hunter Biden. But the president's decision has also brought renewed attention to the power of the presidential pardon. Biden's now facing renewed pressure to commute the sentences of death row prisoners and to pardon or grant clemency to political prisoners like Indigenous leader Leonard Peltier, imprisoned in Florida, and the whistleblowers Edward Snowden and Julian Assange. The group Last Prisoner Project is calling on Biden to use his clemency power to free those still incarcerated in federal prison for cannabis crimes. We're joined now by Jason Ortiz, Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Last Prisoner Project. This is very interesting, Jason. I think they say that Hunter Biden has been clean for something like just over 5 years. His father has openly talked about his son, formerly an addict. And as he faces bipartisan criticism, talk about what you think this is an opening for.
Sure. So this is definitely an opening for folks to talk about exactly how expansive we can use the pardon power of the president to make sure that we're correcting the injustices that were done over the past 20 or 30 years when it comes to cannabis crimes. President Biden himself was actually one of the architects of the 1994 crime bill that created a lot of the outrageous sentences that we're now dealing with today. And so we're seeing that there are over 3,000 federal cannabis prisoners currently incarcerated on cannabis charges. And these are all folks that also have families and have parents and have loved ones, and we have examples like folks like Jonathan Wall, who was somebody that was a Maryland resident. He was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for his first offense. And so while I can understand why the president wants to have compassion for his own son, where we're really getting frustrated is that he's refusing to extend that compassion to all the parents that are currently watching their kids waste away in prison. Mitzi Wall, who works with the organization Freedom Grow, is a mother of Jonathan Wall. She was joining me this past week when we had the congressional press conference, when we were joined by folks like James Clyburn, Congressman James Clyburn, asking for freedom and clemency for folks like Jonathan Wall. And so that's one example of 3,000 folks that are currently in prison. Some of the charges are far more egregious. Folks like Edwin Rubiz was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison in the 90s. And so he's someone that hasn't had a Christmas or holidays with his family. He has a son that's 27 years old. He's currently served 27 years of that federal sentence. He hasn't had a single Christmas with his son because of charges that were orchestrated and architected by President Biden, then as senator, in the crime bill. We have folks that are serving life sentences. Israel Lira, for trafficking charge, is currently sentenced on a life sentence for the same activity that is now legal across the country in 25 different states, including trafficking. And so that would be the distribution of cannabis. And so there is a specific, differentiation between what President Biden's previous pardons were intended to do, which was only covering things like simple possession, where right now we have folks that are serving decades for trafficking, which is exactly what the hundreds of legal cannabis businesses across the country are currently doing on a regular basis, including right in Washington, D.C. And so we're now seeing people sitting in prison for decades for the same activity that is currently generating tax revenue for cities and states across the country. We're paying for schools and building bridges with cannabis activity dollars, but still letting folks waste away in prison. And so while I can definitely understand why a father would want to have compassion for his son and avoid prison time for his son, we're really asking him to extend that same compassion to all the folks that he helped put in prison to begin with.
Jonathan, you mentioned the previous pardons for simple cannabis possession, but that hasn't led to the release of many of those incarcerated individuals. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So those pardons were for simple possession for folks that were currently charged on a federal possession charge. And now it is very rare for someone to actually serve prison time for a simple possession charge at the federal level. That generally happens if somebody maybe got caught, they were smoking in a national park or some other sort of federal property where they were unaware of it. But there are nobody in prison for simple possession in the federal prison system whatsoever. So despite his pardoning of 6,000 charges, 0 people were released. However, the charges that we're looking to actually have folks released for are things like cultivation of cannabis, sales of cannabis. Those are the charges that folks are currently in prison for, and we want him to expand his use of the pardon to cover all cannabis crimes that are now legal in the majority of the country.
Yeah, and Jason, apologies, but Jason, during your press conference last week, you spoke of, quote, the heartbreaking number of Latino fathers incarcerated for life or near-life sentences. How do these cases reflect systemic inequalities in federal sentencing?
So we've seen for the past 50 years or so that the war on drugs has been racially motivated, specifically targeting young black and brown men, and many of those are Latinos. Here in the city of New York, there was millions of arrests. Across the country, we've seen countless young fathers that have been ripped from their families simply because they were trying to make money to help feed their families. And so I was somebody who was arrested in high school at the age of 16. I was lucky enough not to get incarcerated, but only because my parents were able to help me through this ridiculous legal process of keeping a 16-year-old out of prison. And so we're seeing across the country that while these laws are changing, the retroactive relief and the restorative justice for the folks that were impacted has not followed suit with all the cannabis profits that we're seeing developed across the country. And we know without a doubt that the war on drugs was and is still racially motivated, specifically targeting blacks and Latinos. And so we've yet to actually wrestle with that real racist history of the war on drugs. We're simply trying to just move on without addressing the past. And I think the president has an incredible opportunity now to really address the issues that have been developed over the last few years by taking real expansive action, using his clemency power to commute the sentences of the folks that are currently in prison. And roughly half of the folks that are on our list of constituents are Latino. And you can see very clearly just by looking down the list of names who's in there and who is getting out in the future. And Latinos are definitely overrepresented in the prison population generally, but especially in the federal system for cannabis crimes.
So if you look at the clemency statistics by president, Biden is at the almost the lowest outside of George H.W. Bush. Biden, Trump, Obama, W, Clinton, HW, and Reagan. He's number 2 among the lowest. Are you speaking directly? Are your groups speaking directly with the Biden clemency office? How far are these demands going? You're talking about thousands of people.
Yeah, so we have met with White House officials multiple times, and we've explained exactly the folks that we believe are the top candidates for clemency. And while they have been receptive, they have not told us that they're going to take any particular action to help these folks out at all. And so what we are really doing is hoping that they will take action sooner rather than later. It is true that most of the time, most presidents use their clemency powers at the very end of their presidency. However, President Biden has clearly shown that he's not going to wait for everyone to wait until the end of his presidency. He was willing to do a little bit earlier for his son, and so we're asking him to extend the same grace and compassion to all the folks that are currently incarcerated and release them immediately. Let them join their families for the holidays. Let them see their families grow up and bring joy and happiness back into their lives. These are folks that have served a tremendous amount of time already. This is not folks that we're saying did not commit the crime and should be, released without any sort of punishment. Folks like Edwin Ruiz have already served 27 years of their life in federal prison for a cannabis charge. And so while he could wait, we are asking him not to wait, to do this immediately, to show the people that his presidency is going to be one where he will be remembered as addressing the issues that he created and coming to this from a place of compassion and not continuing the process and continuing the damage done by punitive drug policies.
Well, Jason Ortiz, we thank you so much for being with us, Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Last Prisoner Project. Coming up, Israeli journalist, former conscientious objector Haggai Matar, about Gaza and Israel's crackdown on the press. Stay with us. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Israel's renewed its attacks on southern Lebanon, killing at least 12 people, threatening to further unravel Israel's truce with Hezbollah. With the latest attacks, the UN says Israel's committed more than 100 ceasefire violations since agreeing to a ceasefire last week. Meanwhile, Israel's continued its unrelenting assault on Gaza, with attacks on the northern town of Beit Lahia today that killed at least 8 people. 20 others are wounded. In Gaza City, dozens of civilians are feared trapped under the rubble of a 4-story building leveled by an Israeli airstrike. On Monday, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called the situation in Gaza appalling and apocalyptic and said Israel may be guilty of the gravest international crimes. We're joined now by the Israeli journalist and activist Haggai Matar. He's an executive director of Plus 972 magazine and conscientious objector who refused to serve in the Israeli army. He has a new piece in The Nation out today for those who know they have not done enough to stop Israel's war on Gaza. It's nice to have you in studio. We usually speak to you in Tel Aviv, Haggai.
It's good to be here.
So, elaborate on that title in The Nation, the piece that you just wrote, for those who do not feel they've done enough.
Sure, Amy. So
First, it started from a Yom Kippur reflection of myself, of why have I not done enough. I've been running 972, co-directing Local Call in Hebrew, trying to fight for the rights of Palestinians and push back against the horrific acts of massacre and ethnic cleansing my country's been committing in Gaza. And yet it feels like it's just not enough. And why have we not done enough? What could we possibly do more? So it started with a very personal reflection, trying to analyze the reasons of not doing enough, and then saying, well, we have to commit, we have to double down. And especially now with the upcoming Trump presidency, I think this is also a call to Americans saying, your government is clearly not going to get any better in the near future. We need people on the ground mobilizing and taking action, supporting BDS, trying to move the needle and pressuring Israel into ending these atrocities.
And I wanted to ask you about the International Criminal Court's historic decision to indict Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and the former Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant.
2 minutes. Oh, shit. I don't have time to do much else.
Said that the Israeli leaders had,
no.
quote,
I just ripped the
intentionally
tip
and
off my brush.
knowingly
We'll be right
deprived
back.
the civilian
Okay,
population of
well,
Gaza
my
of
brush
life
fell apart
indispensable to their
and I'm running out of
survival.
time, so I'm going to cut this and splice
How
on
was
another
this
section.
received within
I
Israel,
think.
and do you think
So, take two coming up.
in the long term a major impact on Netanyahu and the policies of his government?
Well, thank you, Khan. One of the
But as you can see, that does a little more detail in the background, and the cityscape looks now like it's a little more burning, and
don't get the news that
the ground in front of the wall is a little more defined, as well as their shadows. So I'm going to reset this and then stripe the wall, throw some iris color in the main figure. I think bright green would set it off nicely, polish up those highlights, and then work on the city a little bit more after a smoke. Okay. Alright, take two. I'm just going to continue with the development of the smoke and sort of fiery cityscape there behind the gallows, and then I'm going to throw in the line work on the wall and maybe some iris color on the central figure cain there. So I don't think that'll take full clip on this one. Let's see how much we can get done in the next 24 minutes. Here we go.
Of the ignorant but widely interested literary man to go crawling about on the woodwork between the pigeonholes and to look in here and look in there and to try to make some kind of coherent picture of the whole elaborate system of compartments which has grown up in our academic world. Well, in this series I propose to talk very imperfectly and partially about this, what is our most profound and searching and difficult problem, the problem of human nature. What a piece of work is a man, as Shakespeare said. And of course he illustrated this remark by the whole corpus of his plays. He showed us what a piece of work a man was, and from Falstaff to Cassius, and from Malvolio to Hotspur, from Iago to Cordelia, he showed us the entire range of what this extraordinary multiple amphibian can do and be. Now, in what is to follow, tonight what is to follow, I propose to talk about what sort of a piece of work this strange creature is. And before we come to the contemporary views on the problem, I think it's worthwhile to devote an hour to what our fathers thought about themselves and about human nature. After all, they were no stupider than we are. The difference between us and them is that we know more than they did. But perhaps by knowing more, in some some respects, we don't know as much about certain things as they did. They chose to pay attention to certain things which we don't pay attention to. So that in some ways, it may be that they made up for their general scientific ignorance by certain insights which perhaps we have shut ourselves off from. Well, I shall begin by talking first about the view of man which we find in Homer, the father of Western poetry. We find Homer, of course, is not a philosopher and not a psychologist, but he was an extremely shrewd observer, and he evidently represented the general point of view of his times. And I shall begin by quoting a very interesting passage from the 19th book of the Iliad, which describes the reconciliation of Agamemnon and Achilles. Agamemnon, if you remember, enraged Achilles by taking away his captive, Briseis. And finally, when it became necessary for Achilles to come back into the battle, Agamemnon made a handsome apology in public to Achilles and explained why he had done what he had done. And he says there, I was not to blame. It was Zeus and my bad luck and the fury that walks in the darkness that blinded my judgment that day when I confiscated Achilles' girl. What could I do? At these moments, there is a power that takes command. Ate, the eldest daughter of Zeus, who blinds us, a cursed sprite that she is, flitting through men's heads, corrupting them, bringing down now one, now another. Why, even Zeus was blinded by her once, and he is known to stand above all men and all gods. Achilles accepts this explanation without any hesitation at all. Seems to him completely rational. And he says, how utterly a man can be blinded by Father Zeus. Now, who and what is Ate? In the Greek tragedies, the word stands for disaster. But in Homer, the word stands for the state of mind which brings on disaster, the state of blindness, the state of infatuation, the state of mind which leads us to do all kinds of absurd things against our own interest, things which make no sense to us whatever, and yet we still do them. And Homer personified this strange state of mind as an alien supernatural force which came into man. Sometimes the gods themselves, in their more malicious moments, would come in and upset a man's judgment, but more often they sent this strange kind of fury, this daughter of Zeus, Ate, to carry out their vengeances upon human beings. Now, Homer, of course, makes it quite clear that there are also positive interventions from the supernatural world. In general, these positive interventions are made through the medium of something that he calls menos. And menos is that kind of accession of power and eagerness and strength and vitality which permits us to do the impossible. Even animals are capable of experiencing menos. Horses every now and then get a tremendous influx of menos and do the most extraordinary things in the Iliad. And in general, Homer would have said that any particularly good idea, anything above our ordinary level of intelligence, any remarkable action or great insight is given to us from the outside by a god who hands out his menos to us. And the god sometimes has a name. We know which god is at work within us. But occasionally, and this is particularly true in the Odyssey, the god has no name. He is just called a daimon. He is some sort of a supernatural being. And in general, in Greek, until much later times, any supernatural being to whom one couldn't give a name, Zeus or Aphrodite or Athene, was just called a daimon. For example, the monitions which Socrates received were given him by a daimon, a nameless supernatural being. And it is interesting to note that Socrates, who is after all the father of Western rationalism, says in so many words, the greatest blessings come to us by way of madness, provided always that the madness is given to us as a divine gift, so that he himself recognized this supernatural influx which constantly influenced human beings. Now, Homer's daimons and gods are not mere fairy tale fantasies. They are principles of scientific explanation. He had to account for the very odd facts of human psychology, the fact that human beings are constantly doing things which are obviously against their interests, which they know to be stupid and bad. Similarly, they every now and then do things which seem to be far beyond their normal capacities of action or thought. And it seemed quite rational in the absence of any other hypothesis, I mean such a hypothesis as we have now of the dynamic unconscious. It was only rational to suppose that these strange events of which we are all conscious were due to the influx of supernatural powers. And it's interesting to realize that this idea of possession for good or for ill by supernatural powers went on being used as a principle of explanation right on almost to the end of the 17th century. But contemporary with Galileo and even with Newton, we find this Homeric idea of possession being used currently as an explanation of many forms of many of the odder forms of human behavior. You will find, for example, in that compendium of 17th century psychology, the Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, an extremely good discussion of this whole problem. I mean, she points out that most cases of strange behavior, of madness, madness and what we would call neurosis, most cases have a physical origin, but quite a good proportion of them are probably due to some kind of supernatural possession. And it's very interesting to notice that in the 18th century, when the idea of demonic possession had completely evaporated, nothing was brought in to take its place. We have a curious kind of interregnum, so to speak, in the history of psychology during the 18th and early 19th centuries, when the stranger aspects of human nature simply had no valid explanatory principles to account for them. For example, when the case of Mesmer was examined by the French Academy with the assistance of Benjamin Franklin, the only explanation that they could bring up for the strange phenomena which occurred in Mesmer's neighborhood was imagination. Well, imagination, such as we know it, quite clearly doesn't account for the kind of queer things which were happening in these early days of the hypnotic experimentation. And strangely enough, it is not until quite late in the 19th century that a satisfactory substitute for the old idea of possession comes into the world. It comes in, of course, with the development of the idea of a dynamic, unconscious self, what would be called the unconscious and the pre-conscious, or in general, the subliminal self. And the opening of the new period of psychology is dated by William James with the publication of a paper by F.W.H. Myers in, I think, 1882. So that it is extraordinarily recent that we have any satisfactory substitute for this ancient Homeric and afterwards Christian idea of demonic and divine possession as agents to account for the odder aspects of human behavior. Now, let us pass now for a moment to the practical side of Greek psychology. The Greeks were very realistic people, and they knew very well that the more distressing aspects, the more distressing consequences of possession could be warded off if some kind of satisfaction, either direct or indirect, were found for the instinctive drives and the frustrations and miseries of normal life. And the two great methods which they used, to both of which they applied the term catharsis, the first of them, historically, was the method of the Dionysian orgy and dance. Dionysus, in this context, was called Lucios, the liberator. And he did liberate these people who lived an extraordinarily miserable life if they were slaves from a great deal of their sense of frustration and unhappiness by, first of all, giving them alcohol, and in the second place, encouraging these congregational dances. At a later period, the Dionysian rites seemed to lose their interest, but their place was taken by the Corybantic dances in honor of the Great Mother. And here there was a specifically therapeutic value set upon these dances. For example, the people suffering from what we would now call anxiety syndromes or various types of neurosis were actually diagnosed by the way they responded to certain types of music, and in this way one could judge what daimon or god was possessing them, and suitable dances and religious rites were then prescribed for them, and they worked off in this way a great deal of the neurotic tension which was upsetting them. At this time, the present day, of course, in many parts of the world, one can find exactly the same procedures being carried out. I was greatly struck, for example, 2 years ago when I was in Brazil, by what may be called the Latin American menadism of what is called in Rio Macumba and what is called in Bahia Candomblé, which are essentially adaptations of West African dances. And when you go and see these, one sees very clearly what the Greeks were up to and how effective this kind of therapy was. These unfortunate Negroes living in the most frightful conditions in the favelas of Rio or of Bahia. On Saturday nights, work off their sense of frustration and misery by this night-long dancing. And interestingly enough, in all the dances that I witnessed, there was no question of alcohol involved. The whole procedure was one of this tremendous muscular activity through which immense accumulations of tension and misery were worked off, and by the end of the night, many of the participants, of course, had fallen down in a kind of ecstatic stupor and were prepared to go on with their miserable life during the following week. And it was, to me, very, very interesting to see in these dances actual gestures which are exactly described in the Greek literature about the Maenads. The tossing of the head, for example, which occurs again and again in descriptions of Maenadism in Greece, was clearly exemplified in the candomblé and macumba dances. There was a great deal of this tossing, which I imagine the physiological reason for which is that it drives a great deal of blood into the head by a centrifugal force, and probably produces this kind of ecstatic state very rapidly. Now, come back to the possession theory. The interesting thing about it is that subjectively this is a very realistic theory, because quite clearly these sudden impulses, either for evil or for good, are experienced subjectively as alien impulses. After all, we see this constantly in our idiomatic use of language. We say, "What came over me? I can't have been myself at the moment," and things like this. Or a good idea occurred to me. We never say, "I have invented a good idea." We say, "It has come to me, it has occurred to me." There is this subjective sense that it does come to us from the outside. And in this sense, the possession idea was an extremely realistic one, until one had a better theory, such as we have, or we think we have anyhow. This seemed to be the most sensible explanation of both normal and abnormal behavior. The idea being that there was a self which was invaded from the outside by these alien supernatural forces and was made to do things, either evil things or exceptionally good things, of which the normal self would be quite incapable. And now let us briefly consider, how did Homer envisage the self that was invaded from the outside? He did not envisage it as a unitary soul or personality. There is no word in Homer for the soul. The psyche, he speaks of the psyche, but the psyche is something which exists only at the moment of death. It's the thing that leaves the body and that will become the future shade which people can contact if they go down to Hades. But during life, the psyche is not there at all. During life, the self is a kind of symbiosis of a number of psychophysiological factors working together and living in a rather uneasy consensus and organization, rather unstable and rather uncomfortable all the time. And the factors which Homer describes as being components of the self are, first of all, there are these half physiological factors. There's something which he calls the thumos, which is the seat of feeling which lives in the chest. And then there is the frame, which quite literally is the midriff, which is the organ of passion and of life. Then there is the nous, which is the reasonable, sensible ego, more or less. We would call it, I suppose, the ego. But anyhow, it is the reasonable side of man. But then there is the heart, which fulfills more or less the same kinds of functions as...
Alright, we only have 2 minutes left. I don't have much time to do any more highlighting at the moment. So I'm going to cut it right there. We got some green eyes in them.
So that we see there is this kind of...
And we got a little more detail in cityscape, bricks in the wall, dirt on the ground, starting to re-highlight and accentuate the highlights of the 2 primary figures, central figures. So that's Adam Sturch, broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, Mexico, working on oil painting Cain. Thank you for watching and have a good afternoon, Earth.
He is there, and he may